Vespasian, born Titus Flavius Vespasianus in 09 AV, was one of the most unlikely men ever to become emperor of Rome. Yet his rise to power, his resilience, and his lasting impact on Roman society made him one of the most important figures in the empire's long history and the first ruler of the Flavian dynasty. His story begins in the small town of Falacrina, near Rete, in central Italy, far away from the grandeur of Rome. Unlike the Julio-Claudian emperors who traced their ancestry back to divine connections and aristocratic families, Vespasian came from relatively humble origins. His father was a tax collector, and his mother came from an equestrian background, meaning they were wealthy enough to have status, but far from the noble elite that had traditionally supplied emperors and senators. Vespasian himself was not considered a brilliant youth, nor was he marked out early for greatness. In fact, his older brother, Sabinus, had a more successful early career and was often regarded as the more capable of the two. Yet it was Vespasian's perseverance, practicality, and willingness to endure hardships that set him apart. His journey through the Roman military ranks was not glamorous at first, but it gave him invaluable experience and hardened his character, preparing him for the turbulent years to come when Rome desperately needed stability after the chaos of civil wars. Vespasian entered public life under the reign of Tiberius, the second emperor of Rome, and like many men of his background, he began with minor offices and gradually built his career. He served as a military tribune in Thrace and later as a quaestor in Crete and Cyrene, slowly climbing the cursus honorum, the ladder of Roman political offices. He showed little sign of brilliance, but demonstrated reliability, discipline, and most importantly, the ability to endure. This was an era when Rome valued endurance and practical military skills more than rhetorical flourish, especially in provincial campaigns. During the reign of Caligula, he advanced further, but it was under Emperor Claudius that Vespasian's fortunes began to rise. Claudius valued capable men regardless of their social origins, and Vespasian caught his attention during the Roman conquest of Britain in 43 AD. Commanding the Legio II Augusta, Vespasian played a significant role in the campaign, leading successful operations in southern England, capturing towns, and even subduing the Isle of Wight. His performance in Britain earned him triumphal honors, and more importantly, the respect of his troops, who admired his ability to share in their hardships. He did not try to act like a distant patrician commander, but lived as they did, ate their rations, and endured the same conditions in the field. This bond with the soldiers would later be one of the keys to his success. Following his military successes, Vespasian was rewarded with political advancement. He served as consul in 51 AD and continued his service under Claudius and then Nero. However, his blunt, practical character sometimes put him at odds with the courtly world of Nero's Rome, where flattery, entertainment, and extravagance were valued above discipline and moderation. At one point, Vespasian is said to have fallen out of favor with Nero after showing insufficient enthusiasm for the emperor's endless artistic performances. According to some accounts, Nero banished him from court, leaving him sidelined until circumstances called him back. That call came with the outbreak of the Jewish revolt in 66 AD, one of the most serious uprisings Rome faced in the East. Nero needed an experienced and reliable general, and despite his earlier disgrace, Vespasian was chosen. Along with his son Titus, he was dispatched to Judea to suppress the rebellion. What followed was a grueling and bloody campaign in a land that was fiercely resistant to Roman rule. Vespasian proved once again his patience and practicality, avoiding rash actions and carefully securing one city after another, wearing down the rebels systematically rather than chasing quick victories. The campaign in Judea would eventually bring great glory to his family, particularly after Titus captured Jerusalem in 70 AD. But it also positioned Vespasian perfectly for the dramatic turn of events that shook Rome in 68 as Nero's reign collapsed in chaos, ending with his suicide, and what followed was known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian all laid claim to the throne in a whirlwind of civil wars and shifting loyalties. Vespasian was in the east when this crisis unfolded, but his position was strong. He commanded legions in Judea, Egypt, and Syria, giving him the military might to challenge for the throne. His troops, who trusted him, declared him emperor in 69 AD, and he marched to claim Rome itself. Meanwhile, his rival Vitellius, who had already taken the throne, was struggling to maintain control amid growing opposition. The supporters of Vespasian, led by his generals in Rome, defeated Vitellius's forces, and the new emperor was killed in brutal fashion. With the civil war ended, Vespasian entered Rome as emperor, bringing stability to an empire that had been torn apart by chaos and bloodshed. His reign began in 69 AD, and from the start, he sought to restore order, rebuild confidence, and re-establish financial stability. Rome was nearly bankrupt after years of Nero's extravagance and the costs of civil wars. Vespasian, always frugal and practical, took firm control of the finances. He introduced new taxes, restored discipline to the treasury, and sought ways to raise revenue without crushing the people. Famously, he introduced a tax on public urinals, and when his son Titus criticized the measure as unworthy Vespasian, held a coin to his nose and remarked, "Money does not stink," a saying that became legendary and revealed his dry, pragmatic humor. Unlike Nero, who indulged in grand spectacles and wasted money on vanity projects, Vespasian invested in rebuilding Rome, focusing on practical projects that would both serve the people and enhance his reputation. The most famous of these was the construction of the Flavian amphitheater, better known today as the Colosseum. Built on the site of Nero's extravagant golden house, the Colosseum was a gift to the Roman people, a symbol of Vespasian's intent to replace tyranny and self-indulgence with public generosity and stability. Although it was completed by his son Titus after his death, its beginnings were part of his vision of a Rome that celebrated the people rather than the emperor's ego. Vespasian was also a man of plain habits compared to his predecessors. He did not surround himself with the luxuries of the Julio-Claudian emperors. Instead, he was known for his simple lifestyle, approachable manner, and willingness to listen to advisors. He avoided the pitfalls of paranoia and cruelty that had plagued emperors like Caligula and Nero. Yet he was not without toughness. He could be ruthless when needed, ensuring that opposition was crushed and order maintained, but he preferred practical solutions over theatrical brutality. His reign brought a sense of stability and reassurance that Rome desperately needed after years of chaos. In foreign policy, Vespasian focused on consolidating Rome's frontiers rather than reckless expansion. He strengthened defenses in Britain, secured peace in the east, and ensured that Rome's provinces were governed effectively. He placed trust in capable generals and administrators, many of whom, like himself, came from non-aristocratic backgrounds. This marked a shift in Roman politics. Under the Flavians, the empire became more open to men of talent from provincial and equestrian origins, breaking the dominance of the old senatorial aristocracy. This practical approach helped Rome remain stable and well-administered, creating a model that would last for generations. His personal character also became legendary. Ancient sources describe him as witty, down-to-earth, and sometimes blunt. He disliked flattery and did not hide his disdain for excessive pomp. There are stories of him mocking courtiers who tried to praise him and laughing at attempts to deify him. In fact, on his deathbed in 79 AD, he is reported to have joked, "Oh dear, I think I am becoming a god," poking fun at the tradition of deifying emperors after death. This sense of humor, combined with his practical wisdom, made him a refreshing change after the extravagance and terror of previous reigns. Yet Vespasian's legacy was not only about humor and practicality. He founded a dynasty. His two sons, Titus and Domitian, would succeed him continuing the Flavian line. This ensured a degree of stability in succession, something Rome had lacked in the chaotic year of the 4 emperors. He also left behind an empire stronger and more stable than he had found it, with finances restored, public works underway, and military discipline reasserted. His reign marked the end of the Julio-Claudian experiment and the beginning of a more pragmatic, middle-class-oriented imperial leadership. Vespasian may not have had the aristocratic glamour of Augustus or the theatrical cruelty of Nero, but he gave Rome what it most needed: stability, practicality, and common sense. His rise from modest beginnings to emperor demonstrated that Rome had moved into a new era where ability and endurance could matter more than bloodline, and where the empire was strong enough to survive chaos and emerge renewed. In many ways, Vespasian embodied the virtues of the ordinary Roman citizen, and that is why his reign was remembered as a time of recovery and reassurance after years of instability. His story is one of persistence, discipline, and the power of practical wisdom to restore order in times of chaos, a lesson that is echoed through history as an example of leadership that values substance over show, endurance over extravagance, and stability over chaos. After his successful emergence as the clear victor of the civil wars of 69 CE, Vespasian confronted the monumental task of stabilizing an empire that had been shaken to its core by years of political turbulence, economic strain, military insurrections, and public discontent. And he understood from the beginning that his role as emperor would not be simply to enjoy the spoils of victory, but to construct a durable foundation for Roman governance that could endure beyond his own lifetime. And so he began methodically to consolidate his authority in ways that drew upon both precedent and innovation, seeking not only to secure his personal position, but also to present himself as the restorer of order after a year of unprecedented chaos. For Rome had endured the humiliating spectacle of 4 emperors in quick succession, and the people longed for a sense of continuity and stability, which Vespasian sought to embody through deliberate actions in his first years as princeps. He moved swiftly to establish his legitimacy through several symbolic and practical measures. First, he ensured the Senate ratified his position formally, thereby anchoring his rule in the legal structures of Roman tradition, while at the same time making clear that ultimate authority rested in his hands. Second, he worked to shore up his military base, rewarding the legions who had supported him in the struggle against Vitellius, and making sure that discontented forces were either appeased or disbanded. For he recognized that Rome's emperor survived only so long as the army remained loyal, and the lesson of Galba's fate was not lost on him. At the same time, Vespasian faced the urgent question of finances, for the imperial treasury had been drained by Nero's extravagance, further exhausted by the civil wars and stretched thin by the demands of frontier defense. And so one of his very first priorities was to refill the coffers through both ordinary taxation and more creative revenue schemes, the most famous of which was his tax on public urinals, which gave rise to the phrase, pecunia non olet, money does not stink, a succinct expression of Vespasian's pragmatic view that imperial authority required resources above all else, and that any form of income, so long as it served the stability of the empire, was justified. His fiscal policy, often criticized in later accounts as miserly or overly severe, in fact, represented a practical effort to restore the solvency of the empire, to fund necessary works, and to demonstrate that Rome under his rule would no longer be drained by personal indulgence, but managed with prudence and foresight. And in this way, he carefully distinguished his image from the ruinous spending of Nero and the incompetence of his immediate successors. Alongside these measures, Vespasian was deeply conscious of the need to shape public perception, and he did so by emphasizing modesty, simplicity, and a return to Roman virtues of discipline, frugality, and diligence, deliberately cultivating a reputation for down-to-earth habits and for speaking plainly rather than in the florid style that had characterized Nero's theatrical court. and such simplicity endeared him to many ordinary Romans who had grown weary of emperors who behaved like oriental monarchs rather than citizen leaders. And this plainness of character became one of the most striking features of his reign. Yet Vespasian was not merely a frugal manager. He also pursued an ambitious building program, the most famous and enduring symbol of which was the Flavian amphitheater, better known today as the Colosseum, whose construction he initiated as a gift to the Roman people, financed in part by the spoils of the Jewish war, and designed to stand as a monument to Flavian generosity and the grandeur of Rome, replacing the hated Golden House of Nero with a public space of spectacle and communal entertainment, thereby both erasing the memory of tyranny and ingratiating the Flavian dynasty with the populace. This act alone demonstrates Vespasian's astute understanding of propaganda and the role of architecture in shaping collective memory by repurposing Nero's private extravagance into a public arena. He transformed resentment into gratitude and ensured that his family's name would be associated with Rome as greatest monument. His concern for the provinces was no less significant, for he recognized that the empire's stability depended not only on the capital, but also on the vast network of territories stretching across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, and he worked to integrate these lands more thoroughly into the imperial system, granting increased citizenship rights, fostering local elites loyal to Rome, and investing in provincial infrastructure that facilitated trade, communication, and military deployment, thereby ensuring that the empire's peripheries were bound more closely to its center. In Judea, the suppression of the revolt continued under his son Titus, culminating in the capture of Jerusalem in 70 CE and the destruction of the Second Temple, a moment of enormous significance, both for Roman prestige and for Jewish history. And the Flavian triumph, celebrated in Rome afterwards, complete with the famous Arch of Titus, commemorating the spoils carried off from the temple, underscored the dynasty's claim to have restored order and expanded Roman glory, even as it inflicted a wound that would define Jewish memory for centuries. Vespasian himself, though not present at the siege, understood the importance of using this victory to bolster his authority, and he carefully staged the triumph to emphasize the legitimacy of Flavian power, presenting his family as divinely favored conquerors who had avenged rebellion and secured the Pax Romana once more. Yet while he reveled in military success, he remained cautious in foreign policy overall, preferring consolidation to reckless expansion. And during his reign, Rome's frontiers were strengthened, particularly in Britain, where the general Agricola began campaigns of subjugation in Wales and northern England, and in Germany, where Vespasian fortified positions to defend against incursions. His reign thus marked a shift away from Nero's neglect and Galba's hesitation toward a stable and assertive, but not overreaching imperial posture designed to project strength without courting disaster. Culturally, the Flavian era saw a revival of Latin literature and the arts, patronized by the emperor and his circle, but also shaped by the broader climate of recovery after turmoil, with authors like Quintilian Martial and Statius flourishing under an environment where imperial favor and private ambition converged, and where Rome's cultural life once again found stability after the disruptions of the civil wars. Vespasian himself, though not a man of letters, appreciated the role of culture in strengthening Rome's identity and in immortalizing his reign, and he tolerated a degree of freedom among writers provided they did not openly challenge imperial authority, a stance that contrasted with the paranoia of earlier emperors and contributed to a sense of moderation in his rule. Religion, too, played a part in his policies, for he cultivated the support of traditional priesthoods, emphasized the favor of the gods in his rise to power, and promoted the imperial cult as a unifying force across the provinces, thereby reinforcing both spiritual legitimacy and political loyalty. In all these ways, Vespasian's reign in its early and middle years can be seen as a deliberate program of restoration, stabilization, and preparation for dynastic continuity, for he was deeply aware that his family's hold on power would not be secure unless it passed smoothly to his sons. And so he invested not only in his own reputation, but also in grooming Titus and Domitian as heirs, integrating them into public life, and ensuring that Rome would perceive the Flavian dynasty as a lasting and legitimate ruling house rather than a temporary solution to civil war. This long-term vision set him apart from the short-lived emperors of 6869 CE, whose lack of dynastic planning had contributed to chaos, and by focusing on dynasty economy propaganda and military loyalty, Vespasian constructed a framework that would outlive him and shape Roman politics for the next generation. As Vespasian's reign continued to mature, he became increasingly focused on the consolidation of imperial authority, the careful balancing of senatorial traditions with the realities of autocratic power, and the long-term stability of the Roman Empire. By the early years of the 70s CE, Rome was recovering from the devastating civil wars of 68 to 69 CE. And while Vespasian had established himself as the legitimate emperor, his rule still rested on fragile foundations. Unlike dynastically secure emperors such as Augustus or Tiberius in their earlier years, Vespasian had risen to power not through succession, but through civil conflict, and thus he faced the constant challenge of legitimizing his rule in the eyes of the Senate, the army, and the Roman people. His methods of solidifying this legitimacy and the policies he enacted would become the defining characteristics of his reign. He showed a talent for being both pragmatic and shrewd, never leaning too heavily into ideological claims, but instead grounding his authority in practical governance, financial reform, and military success. One of the cornerstones of his rule was his relationship with the Senate. The Senate, by this time, no longer held the supreme power it once enjoyed during the days of the Republic, but it still retained great prestige, and its recognition was essential to imperial legitimacy. Vespasian understood this dynamic well, and though he ruled as an emperor in the strictest sense, he made careful attempts to restore senatorial dignity and involvement in governance. Unlike Nero, who had alienated the Senate with his extravagance and disregard, Vespasian presented himself as a man who valued senatorial traditions and who was willing to collaborate with Rome's elite. His treatment of the Senate was far more conciliatory, even if in practice the emperor retained ultimate authority. He allowed senators more freedom in debate, filled its ranks with capable men of provincial background, and refrained from excessive purges, which had become characteristic of earlier reigns. This earned him goodwill among aristocrats and helped stabilize the political environment of Rome. In tandem with this, Vespasian's economic reforms were among the most important aspects of his rule. The Roman treasury had been left in a dire state after Nero's reckless spending and the subsequent civil wars, and Vespasian's success would depend on restoring financial stability to the empire. He was relentless in this regard. Known for his frugality, he imposed new taxes, restructured financial administration, and found innovative ways to replenish Rome's coffers. One of his most famous measures was the imposition of a tax on public latrines, which became proverbial in Roman memory for his practical approach to revenue. When criticized for the measure, he is said to have held up a coin from the revenue and remarked that money does not smell, a phrase pecunia non olet that became legendary in Roman history. This episode illustrates both his pragmatic character and his unpretentious style of governance. He did not shy away from unglamorous solutions if they provided tangible benefits for the empire. These economic reforms had wide-reaching effects. They not only allowed the empire to recover from bankruptcy, but also gave Vespasian the means to fund his ambitious building programs. His vision for Rome's infrastructure was not simply about grandeur, though his works were impressive. It was also about practical utility and long-term stability. Among his most enduring contributions was the initiation of the Flavian amphitheater, later known as the Colosseum. This monumental structure, begun under his reign and completed under his son Titus, was not only a marvel of engineering, but also a political gesture. By building such a magnificent venue for public entertainment, funded with spoils from the Jewish war, Vespasian provided a space for mass gatherings, spectacles, and celebrations that reinforced imperial authority and gained the affection of the Roman populace. The Colosseum became a lasting symbol of Roman grandeur and one of the most iconic architectural legacies of antiquity. In addition to the Colosseum, Vespasian repaired and constructed various temples, forums, and other public works that restored Rome after the chaos of civil war. His construction projects often carried deeper meaning. They were physical representations of stability, permanence, and the restoration of Roman greatness under Flavian rule. Where Nero had squandered resources on personal extravagance, such as the Domus Aurea, Vespasian deliberately built structures that served the public and glorified Rome. This contrast did not go unnoticed by contemporaries and later historians, who saw in him a return to responsible leadership. His public works, though funded by heavy taxation, were carefully justified as investments in Rome's future. On the military front, Vespasian continued to consolidate Roman power across the provinces. His most notable military achievement during his reign was the conclusion of the Jewish War, which had begun under Nero. Having left his son Titus in command, Vespasian oversaw the final stages of the campaign from Rome, and the ultimate capture of Jerusalem in 70 CE was celebrated as a triumph of Flavian strength. The destruction of the Second Temple, while devastating for Jewish history, provided Rome with immense spoils and solidified the military prestige of the new dynasty. The triumph celebrated by Titus and Vespasian in Rome was one of the grandest in history, with prisoners paraded through the streets and treasures displayed, including the sacred menorah from the temple. This victory not only reinforced Flavian legitimacy, but also created a narrative of divine favor, as the destruction of Jerusalem was framed as a punishment of rebellion and a vindication of Roman supremacy. The spoils from Judea financed much of Vespasian's ambitious programs, both in Rome and throughout the empire. The triumphal Arch of Titus, though dedicated after Vespasian's death, immortalized the event and became a cornerstone of Flavian propaganda. This use of victory and spectacle to cement political authority was typical of Vespasian's approach. He did not rely on extravagant claims of divine ancestry, as some emperors before him had done, but rather grounded his legitimacy in concrete achievements, military success, economic restoration, and visible public benefit. Vespasian also paid careful attention to the provinces. He expanded opportunities for provincial elites to enter the Roman Senate and administration, thereby integrating diverse regions more deeply into the empire. This inclusiveness marked a significant shift in Roman policy, as it allowed men from Spain, Gaul, and other distant provinces to rise to high positions of power. By broadening the base of Roman elite society, Vespasian ensured that loyalty extended beyond the old Italian aristocracy. This policy of provincial integration helped strengthen the empire's cohesion and prepared the ground for a more cosmopolitan Roman elite in future generations. Another critical element of Vespasian's rule was his emphasis on discipline and order. Having risen from a relatively modest background, he was not a man of luxury, and he expected the same seriousness from those around him. He avoided the indulgences that had tarnished emperors like Nero or Caligula, and instead cultivated an image of simplicity and responsibility. His sense of humor, however, was also well known, and he was often remembered for his witty remarks. This combination of seriousness in governance and personal modesty in lifestyle contributed to the perception of him as a capable and balanced ruler. The broader Roman public, however, experienced Vespasian's reign in more tangible ways. Through the stability he provided, the jobs created by his building projects, and the spectacles that entertained the masses. The games held in the Colosseum and other venues, while costly, were carefully balanced with economic prudence, and they served to maintain popular support. Vespasian understood the Roman need for spectacle and ensured that his reign provided it, but without the excessive waste of his predecessors. This delicate balance between entertainment and responsibility helped sustain his popularity. Religion also played a role in his consolidation of power. Vespasian did not claim divine descent, but he did carefully foster the idea of divine favor. During the civil wars, omens and prophecies had circulated that a ruler would emerge from Judea. The Flavians capitalized on this by framing Vespasian's victory in the Jewish war as the fulfillment of prophecy, thereby linking his reign to destiny. Additionally, stories circulated of miraculous healings performed by Vespasian in Alexandria, where he was said to have cured blindness and lameness by touch. While modern readers might see these as propaganda, in antiquity they were powerful symbols of divine approval and reinforced his claim to imperial authority. In the final analysis of this stage of his reign, Vespasian demonstrated a remarkable capacity for pragmatic leadership. His rule was not marked by ideological innovation or radical reforms, but by a steady and consistent application of practical governance. He rebuilt Rome's finances, strengthened the military, fostered senatorial dignity, integrated the provinces, and left behind enduring monuments that celebrated Roman glory. Through all of this, he cultivated a reputation not of brilliance or extravagance, but of competence, stability, and reliability. For an empire exhausted by civil war, these qualities were exactly what was needed. By the time the 70 CE drew to a close, Vespasian had not only secured his throne, but also laid the foundations for a dynasty. His sons Titus and Domitian were positioned as heirs, and though their reigns would bring their own challenges, the Flavian dynasty stood firmly established. Vespasian's reign exemplified the transition from the chaos of the year of the four emperors to the stability of a restored imperial order, achieved not through grandiose visions, but through practical action and grounded leadership. In this, his legacy grew to be one of the most respected among Roman emperors, remembered less for dramatic exploits than for his ability to restore order, prosperity, and dignity to a fractured empire. The later years of Emperor Vespasian's reign marked a period of consolidation, stability, and careful governance that would firmly establish the Flavian dynasty's credibility after the chaos of the year of the four emperors. By this stage in his reign, Vespasian had weathered the immediate crisis of civil war, the economic exhaustion of Rome, and the delicate balance of reasserting imperial power without alienating the Senate or the people. Now, his focus was on long-term reform, strengthening institutions, and ensuring that Rome would not relapse into the instability that had nearly destroyed the empire only a few years before. To achieve this, Vespasian had to continue balancing military needs, financial recovery, and domestic political strategy, while also grooming his sons Titus and Domitian for leadership. One of the defining features of these later years was Vespasian's continued emphasis on economic reform and financial prudence. The Roman treasury had been badly drained by Nero's extravagance, followed by the ruinous civil wars of 68 to 69 CE. To stabilize the empire's finances, Vespasian was both frugal in his own personal spending and innovative in raising revenue for the state. His tax policies became legendary, especially his introduction of the urine tax, which levied a fee on the collection of urine from public latrines used in tanning and other industries. When Titus criticized the unseemliness of profiting from such a source, Vespasian famously held a coin to his son's nose and remarked that money has no smell. This pragmatic approach symbolized his broader philosophy. Rome's strength depended on steady income, and all means of raising it, no matter how humble or undignified, were worthwhile if they secured the empire's stability. At the same time, Vespasian sought to encourage productivity and economic recovery across the provinces. He invested in restoring roads, rebuilding cities damaged by the wars, and supporting agriculture, which was the backbone of Roman society. His policies helped stimulate trade and ensured that the provinces felt the benefits of being tied to Rome's central authority. By taking a hands-on approach to financial oversight and avoiding the reckless excesses of emperors like Nero, Vespasian restored trust in the stability of the imperial regime. A major hallmark of these later years was Vespasian's program of building and infrastructure. He understood that great monuments not only served practical purposes, but also acted as lasting propaganda for his dynasty, symbolizing renewal after the chaos of civil war. The most famous of these projects was the Flavian amphitheater, later known as the Colosseum. Construction began under Vespasian in 72 CE, funded largely by the spoils of the Jewish war. The amphitheater was built on the site of Nero's extravagant golden house, a deliberate political statement that land once reserved for one man's decadent pleasure would now be used for the enjoyment of the Roman people. It was designed to host gladiatorial contests, hunts, and public spectacles, making it a gift to the Roman populace that would forever be associated with the Flavians. Though it was not completed until after Vespasian's death, its foundations and early stages were his vision, and it became one of the most enduring symbols of Rome's imperial grandeur. Beyond the Colosseum, Vespasian funded the construction and repair of aqueducts, including the Aqua Claudia and the Aqua Marcia, ensuring that Rome's growing population had access to clean water. He restored temples and public buildings that had fallen into disrepair during the civil wars. His building projects were carefully chosen to contrast with Nero's, who had built lavish palaces for himself. Vespasian's constructions emphasized utility, tradition, and service to the public, aligning his reign with the values of Rome's earlier, more austere leaders. This strategy was not only practical, but also politically savvy, as it reminded the people that he was their benefactor, not a distant despot. Military policy remained central during these years as well. Vespasian had secured the empire after the defeat of Vitellius, but Rome's frontiers remained vulnerable. He reorganized the army, reducing the number of legions to a manageable size and carefully redistributing them to key frontiers. He stationed legions in the provinces to act as deterrents against rebellion and invasion, particularly in places like Britain, the Rhine frontier, and the eastern provinces. His reforms strengthened discipline, reduced waste, and ensured loyalty to the emperor rather than to individual generals. The Jewish War continued to be a defining element of his reign. Even after its conclusion in 70 CE, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple under Titus had given Rome immense spoils and political capital, which Vespasian used to consolidate power. He established the Fiscus Judaicus, a tax levied on Jews across the empire, requiring them to pay what had once gone to the temple in Jerusalem directly to the Roman treasury. This served both as a financial measure and a symbol of Rome's dominance. At the same time, the war gave his dynasty prestige, associating the Flavians with military triumph and divine favor. Domestically, Vespasian maintained a delicate relationship with the Senate. While he had no intention of restoring the Senate's dominance in Roman politics, he respected its traditions and sought to avoid the open hostility that emperors like Tiberius and Nero had provoked. He allowed senators to debate and maintain their formal dignity, but real power remained with him. By integrating equestrians and provincial elites into the administration, he widened the social base of the empire's ruling class. This helped him both govern more effectively and reduce the Senate's ability to act as a closed, aristocratic elite hostile to new men like himself. His reign was thus marked by both continuity with Rome's traditions and innovation in widening access to power. Another critical aspect of these later years was Vespasian's preparation for succession. He was acutely aware of the dangers that had come from unclear succession during the year of the four emperors, and he sought to ensure a smooth transition to his sons. Titus, his elder son, had already distinguished himself as a general in the Jewish war and was clearly being groomed to succeed. Domitian, younger and less experienced, remained a secondary figure during these years, but was still given opportunities to demonstrate his potential. Vespasian's choice to establish a dynastic principle was a significant step, signaling that the Flavians intended to rule as a legitimate imperial family not merely as temporary strongmen. By making his sons visible in public roles and associating them with imperial authority, he sought to avoid the kind of chaos that had destroyed previous emperors. Public opinion of Vespasian during these later years was generally favorable. His pragmatic approach, his avoidance of ostentation, and his investment in public welfare contrasted sharply with the excesses of Nero. Ordinary Romans benefited from the games, buildings, and economic stability he provided. His humor and down-to-earth style made him seem approachable, even as he wielded supreme power. Suetonius records anecdotes of his wit, which endeared him to many. Yet, despite his popularity, he was not universally loved. His strict taxation and financial measures sometimes drew resentment, and the Jewish war left deep scars in the provinces. Still, compared to his predecessors, he was seen as a stabilizer and restorer of order. In the provinces, his rule brought relative calm. After the upheavals of the civil wars, the provinces were eager for stability, and Vespasian delivered. His integration of provincial elites into Roman politics created a sense of inclusion and loyalty. He also placed great emphasis on Romanization, promoting Latin culture, language, and institutions throughout the empire. His policies laid the groundwork for the long-term integration of diverse peoples into the Roman system. As he aged, Vespasian began to slow his activity, but he remained engaged in governance. Even in his final years, he continued to oversee projects and maintain control of the empire. His death in 79 CE came after an illness, and in characteristic fashion, he is said to have remarked, "Oh dear, I think I am becoming a god," mocking the tradition of deifying emperors. This wit and humility reflected the character he had displayed throughout his reign. His succession by his son Titus marked the successful establishment of the Flavian dynasty, ensuring continuity after decades of chaos. The legacy of Vespasian's later years is one of enduring stability. He transformed the role of emperor from the extravagant figure of Nero or the short-lived opportunists of the civil wars into a practical, steady, and service-oriented leader. His building projects reshaped the city of Rome. His financial reforms restored solvency to the empire, and his military reorganization secured the frontiers. Most importantly, his careful preparation for succession allowed Rome to avoid another descent into civil war. Through pragmatism, discipline, and a keen understanding of public perception, Vespasian ensured that his dynasty would not only survive, but flourish in the years after his death. In hindsight, Vespasian's reign can be seen as a turning point in imperial history. It marked the transition from the Julio-Claudian line, which had often been marked by scandal and instability, to a new dynasty that emphasized order and practicality. The Flavian dynasty owed its survival to Vespasian as careful leadership and the foundations he laid in these later years. His reign demonstrated that emperors did not need to be aristocratic prodigies or divine figures, but could emerge from provincial, equestrian backgrounds if they possessed discipline, pragmatism, and the ability to command loyalty. This legacy would resonate throughout the history of Rome, shaping perceptions of what an emperor could and should be. As Vespasian entered the final phase of his reign, he was increasingly conscious of the long-term stability of the empire, the preservation of his dynasty, and the enduring impact of his governance on Roman history. And in these last years, he continued to govern with the same combination of practicality, prudence, and political acumen that had defined his rise to power. Despite the pressures of ruling a vast empire, Vespasian remained deeply involved in both domestic and foreign affairs, ensuring that the administrative machinery he had established continued to function smoothly, that the army remained disciplined and loyal, and that the provinces felt both the power and the protective reach of Rome. He was acutely aware that his own mortality would soon necessitate the transfer of authority to his sons, Titus and Domitian, and he took deliberate steps to ensure that succession would proceed without dispute. Unlike the turbulence of the year of the 4 emperors, which had demonstrated the fragility of imperial authority in the absence of a clear heir, In this period, he focused on reinforcing the legitimacy of the Flavian dynasty through both tangible and symbolic measures: construction projects, religious and cultural patronage, military victories, fiscal management, and the promotion of public welfare, all of which worked together to consolidate the perception of a stable and beneficent regime. One of the central features of his later reign was his ongoing investment in the Roman economy and administration, as he continued to rebuild the treasury that had been depleted under Nero and the subsequent civil wars, instituting reforms to streamline tax collection, minimize corruption, and ensure a steady flow of resources to fund both civic projects and the army. Understanding that financial solvency was the bedrock upon which all other imperial authority rested, he maintained his famously pragmatic approach, often seeking revenue from unexpected sources while avoiding unnecessary extravagance. And this practical orientation earned him a reputation as a ruler who understood the mechanics of power as much as its symbolic aspects. At the same time, Vespasian remained a hands-on governor, taking a keen interest in provincial affairs, responding to unrest, and personally inspecting key military commands when necessary. His military policies in the final years were aimed at consolidating Rome's borders, ensuring that legions were stationed strategically, and that officers were both competent and loyal, a continuation of the careful military oversight that had marked his entire reign. He avoided unnecessary campaigns, recognizing that stability and order were more important than conquest, though he did support his generals in maintaining control over rebellious provinces and securing Roman authority across the empire. The Colosseum, which had become the most famous symbol of the Flavian dynasty, neared completion in his lifetime, though it would not officially open until after his death. And its construction represented the culmination of his long-standing vision of public service, demonstrating the emperor's commitment to the populace while also asserting the grandeur of Rome and the legitimacy of the Flavian line. Vespasian also continued to foster culture, learning, and religious observance, understanding that these elements reinforced social cohesion and imperial legitimacy. Patronage of literature, the arts, and religious institutions allowed him to cultivate public perception and strengthen the moral and cultural authority of his reign. Through these actions, Vespasian sought to project an image of moderation, virtue, and competence, countering the excesses of previous emperors while establishing a template for what a stable and effective ruler could achieve. His wit, down-to-earth character, and personal discipline became widely known, and anecdotes of his humor and pragmatism circulated among both elites and the general populace, contributing to a sense that the Flavian emperor was both authoritative and approachable. During these later years, Vespasian's health began to decline, but he remained actively engaged in governance until the very end, demonstrating his enduring commitment to the state and the dynasty he had founded. Even in illness, he continued to attend to matters of finance, military command, and public works, never abdicating responsibility or allowing the machinery of government to falter. His death in 79 CE, reportedly following a brief illness, was met with widespread mourning across Rome and the provinces, and his final words delivered with characteristic wit. "Oh dear, I think I am becoming a god," reflected both his humor and the Roman tradition of deifying emperors posthumously, emphasizing the enduring nature of his legacy. The succession of his son Titus proceeded smoothly, fulfilling Vespasian's careful planning and securing the Flavian dynasty for the immediate future. And this smooth transition was a testament to his foresight, political skill, and practical leadership. In the years following his death, historians and contemporaries alike praised Vespasian for restoring order after a period of civil chaos, for his frugality and financial acumen, his military prudence, his public works, and his attention to cultural and religious institutions, and he came to be seen as the archetype of a capable, stabilizing emperor whose policies laid the groundwork for continued prosperity under the Flavians. His emphasis on practical governance, modest personal habits, and attention to both the military and civilian spheres set a standard for subsequent emperors, and demonstrated that effective leadership depended on balanced foresight and the ability to blend authority with accessibility. Vespasian's legacy was not one of ostentation or flamboyance, but of enduring structures, both physical and institutional, that preserved the empire and strengthened its foundations, ensuring that the chaos of the past would not be repeated. He left a lasting imprint on Roman architecture, governance, and imperial culture, and through his sons, he ensured that the Flavian dynasty would continue to rule for decades, with a legitimacy and stability that had eluded many of his predecessors. The restoration of Rome's finances, the consolidation of military loyalty, the construction of enduring public monuments, the careful management of the provinces, and the preparation of competent heirs, all contributed to a reign remembered as one of measured, prudent stability and effective governance, marking Vespasian as one of Rome's most successful emperors and establishing a model for emperors who would follow him in the centuries to come. In summary, the final years of Vespasian's reign reflect a culmination of his lifelong dedication to order, practical leadership, and the consolidation of imperial authority, with every aspect of his governance, from financial reform to public works, military policy to cultural patronage, carefully calibrated to ensure the longevity of both the empire and his dynasty, leaving a legacy that resonated throughout Roman history and became a benchmark for what an emperor could achieve when guided by prudence, discipline, and a deep understanding of the needs of both state and people.